The federal government has projected about 60.97 trillion naira in oil revenue for the 2026 fiscal year, reflecting more conservative assumptions on crude oil prices and production. The estimate is based on a benchmark oil price of $64.85 per barrel, daily production of 1.84 million barrels, and an exchange rate of 1,400 to the dollar. This implies output of about 671.6 million barrels and gross earnings of $43.55 billion, lower than the 78.95 trillion naira projected for 2025. President Bola Tinubu said that the assumptions reflect realism amid global market uncertainty and domestic constraints. Petran backed the projections, citing improved security, host community engagement, and upstream investments as key to achieving targets. AbdulMajeed Amussah, CEO and founder, Diaz Nigeria, joins me now in compliments of the season, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Compliments of the season.
Thank you. And let's come to the topic now. The federal government, why would you say, we know that this was even an issue within the House when they were debating it, the conservative or reserved assumptions, even when it comes to production volume. We know that we've projected 2 million barrels per day, so they're bringing it down to 1.8. So why did the federal government adopt more conservative oil prices and production assumptions for 2026 budget compared to this year?
Yeah, I mean, you said it earlier. The punchline is that this is realism and not pessimism. So because optimism hasn't paid the bills, there's only so long you can keep wishing for something that you yourself have come to realize that might be very difficult for you to achieve. So the government is learning from repeated revenue shortfalls, and it has decided to choose a more credible, budgeting, plan rather than a wishful, thinking. So the conservative assumptions would reduce the financing gaps, would reduce the borrowing pressures, and would also kind of maybe bring an end to the media budget crisis, because it's an issue right now. So what we're seeing federal government doing is learning from what didn't work before and doing something that they believe is more conservative to get us on a more realistic path, which is very important.
Okay, realism. Let's come and focus on the production per day target. This year we've averaged 1.5, maybe kissed 1.7, and now we're aiming for 1.84 million barrels per day. How realistic is that? Do you think that we can hit that target, or is it still out of reach for us?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we can. It's an aspirational target. That's the first things first. And when you set a target, you want to leapfrog to meet your target. You want to do something exceptional, out of the box that would deliver your target. So you want to push yourself to grow, which is the way to go. And what has happened is that government has also taken a more conservative stance on this production target, which we believe maybe this is out of, internal arrangements that have provided a more realistic path to getting closer to this production target. So it's not impossible, it's aspirational, and we have the reserves, we have the capacity. But, it's always been an execution issue, consistency issue. So if we can ensure that security stays top-notch within that area, infrastructure is up, round the clock, there is, there's very little downtime, and that the investment required to keep the operators, afloat, is also provided, at the right time, and bureaucracy is kind of managed better. What will happen is that 1.84 can be a stretch, but the issue is not the geology, whether we have it to bring it out. It's the governance to manage a sector that can become more productive very quickly.
Right. And I mean, you've highlighted some measures that can be taken or should be taken. The question is, are they being taken? Have they been taken? Or is it another aspirational? Are the measures to getting to these aspirational goals, are those measures also aspirational? Are we there yet? Are we doing those things, or we're just saying, okay, this needs to be done and it's not being done?
Yeah, to be honest, right, what we're seeing now, that political will that we want to see in actually strengthening these things, we have been seeing it. right? We've been seeing that body language from government trying to ensure that the sector actually, provides that, that benefit that we as a country are yearning for. So the measures, in terms of trying to close the gap are work in progress. That's what you must say. These are not things that you can just, even a presidential order is not enough to settle these matters. These are matters that require engagement, stakeholder management, consistent planning, tracking, monitoring, evaluation, continuous improvement and things like that, because you can't see it all in one day. You have to keep looking for the data to guide you. So from securing the pipelines, one has to imagine that the community buy-in has to be well strengthened. The communities have to see themselves, in the middle of these projects as beneficiaries, so that they continue to protect it as their own, and then fast tracking approvals for operators, that bureaucracy that I mentioned before, just ensuring that, people who are in the sector trying to get things done are not being held back by the system itself, and then attracting capital by ensuring that there is clarity along, there's clarity in regulation, there's clarity, there's consequence for also not, meeting your targets and your statutory requirements and things like that. So when things like that start to play and they see that the body language of the government is consistent and it's in line with all the things that we wish for, then targets can move from being theoretical to actual, to being more actual. And it is possible. We just need to be consistent. And like I said, it is work in progress. Government is showing the body language. Is it going to deliver the promises? That's what we're hoping for. But it will be a matter of time for us to see that.
Indeed, we'll be tracking all of that. Hopefully the body language translates to real outcomes. But sticking with the projections, how significant is the projected 17.98 trillion naira drop in oil revenue? How much of an impact do you see that having on fiscal stability and budget implementation?
It's huge. 17 trillion, 18 trillion is not a small amount of money. It's material. It is painful. There are projects that we're hoping they would finally see the day of light if that money was also included. But what this does is that it tightens the fiscal space. It limits capital spending. It makes you want to think outside the box. It can also raise borrowing needs because the needs are not going to be wished away. But it also forces discipline. It accelerates this diversification that we have been wishing for. If you keep throwing money at things, it will be difficult for you to sit down and figure out how to make money out of what you already have. And this is what Nigeria desperately needs to do. We need to diversify the economic base of the country by investing in those other things, that we have not already, put a lot of effort in before now. Things that are softer and can bring, results much quicker,
And hopefully we see
and the borrowing costs, because there is less money, you're more desperate to borrow. So it is possible that you might find yourself with higher costs of borrowing and things like that. But these are the things that the managers of this budget would need to push the right ministries and agencies to actually diversify the economy now. The blue economy, and other, the tourism economy, the entertainment economy, and all of other things, the renewable energy, energy transition, the AI investments. Those are all the things that we can start to consider that can become multiple X's in terms of revenue if they are invested in properly,
Yeah, and we've focused on the domestic measures, but we'll turn after this break to what's happening on the global scene with oil and how that's feeding in to this conversation as well. Stay tuned. Conservative assumptions for the 2026 budgets when it comes to oil, the benchmark, production, and much more. We have AbdulMajeed joining us. He's been giving us quite the perspective to this conversation and how that gap will be filled. But let's now come to the global oil community and sector. To what extent do you see continued global oil price volatility? To what extent do you see undermining the 2026 revenue projections? We're hearing stories of oversupply. And it's the 3 consecutive years of decline in oil prices. So how is all of that feeding in here locally?
Honest, what you've just described is something that is a moving target. So you see this oil revenue in a volatile world like we're seeing today is something that you cannot rely on. Is very risky. And you can see that commodity prices recently have mostly been shaped by geopolitics. Oil prices specifically have been affected by energy transition pressures, global demand uncertainties. These are things that are changing consistently as technology and other things are improving. So Nigeria has very, very, very limited control over the risk when it comes to oil prices and things like that. So just like other countries, other nations in this kind of moment, it's time to start thinking inward. It's time to start thinking about prioritizing things that you have more control over, so that in times of, when it gets bad, you're not left completely, in the dark or in the wrong place. So the idea is for us to see these moments as opportunities for us to build internal systems and, and diversify our investment base as a nation. Let's start, investing into things that actually make us competitive, more competitive, have our own competitive advantage, pretty much. Let's look inward. Let's invest in things that help us to stand out within the region, within the continent, and and make revenue from those things. There are a lot of low-hanging fruits that are possible. So it is true that it's very risky. The oil prices is not something Nigeria as a nation has control over, and it's going to do what it does. So you as a nation, just like the moves that we're seeing in terms of being more conservative, it's about managing the risk from the negative impact of what could come out of those oil prices. But there are other ways, there's the mining, there's mining, for example, and other things that countries can look into to kind of, bolster up their commodity management.
So more diversify, and diversify some more.
Yeah, in this moment.
And we know that we've been very dependent on oil, especially when it comes to foreign exchange earnings. But reduced prices, some would say that we can perhaps make up for that when it comes to volumes in production. Looking at what's happening, you've highlighted the security issue also affecting production volumes. Would you say, looking at the current allocation to security, is it sufficient to protect critical oil and gas infrastructure nationwide, or it's beyond allocations at this point?
Oh yeah, definitely is beyond allocation. Has a lot to do with stakeholder management, especially at the community level. So oil theft, and vandalism of, oil infrastructure is a big problem for us. And Nigeria, often produces oil that either we can't evacuate it or we're struggling to account for the complete, for the numbers, So until we find ways to kind of plug these losses, these leakages, revenue projections will continue to, it will be difficult for us to put a complete, to really rely on those projections, because, if every single oil that comes out of the ground is accounted for and it gets to where it's supposed to get to and that revenue is called in, that would be amazing. So it's about closing the leakages, it's about plugging the holes and ensuring that security is well taken care of, the community is involved, the PIA and all those other measures that have been put into place to bring about that, that sanity, that safety, that comfort for, oil operators to do their work safely, and for every single drop of oil that comes out of the ground is evacuated to the right place and is sold for the country's benefit. Those struggles will still be there. So this is what we must do. And there are measures in place in this direction. There's been a lot of wins in this direction. It's about sustaining the momentum and continuously improving the things that are working, pretty much.
Sustaining the momentum. We also know, speaking of momentum, there has been a major shakeup within the sector, especially when it comes to the regulators. How critical is this shift for the regulator, to the reforms and the outcomes that we hope to see within the sector? And, also speaking of funding, how critical is funding for regulators like NUPRC, NMDPRA, to restoring investor confidence in Nigeria's oil and gas sector?
Yeah, let me just put this background as a start. In any sector, any industry, a strong regulator reduces uncertainty. This is very important for operators. And investors do not fear a tough regulator. What they fear is an unclear and an underfunded regulation. So it's important that our regulators are well supported and they have a structure that can actually manage the industries and the sector and play the middleman that ensures fair play for the end consumer, fair play for the operators, and ensure the greatest benefit for the people and the nation at large. That's something that must be at the minds of the public servants at those regulatory agencies because we're all relying on them to bring the best, to us Nigerians, for us to have a better life, better living conditions, more productive businesses, and things like that. Mm-hmm. So their roles are critical. They must be supported. They must be well funded so that they can actually deliver, for Nigerians.
Right. Thank you so much for your perspective on the show. And I think before we tie things together, your projections for the sector or outlook for 2026.
Yeah, so 2026 really is about diversification. The government has put a lot of effort in the energy transition plan. And what we're going to see is people identifying that there are options and there are other ways of meeting their needs in terms of energy, in terms of transport, in terms of productivity and industrialization. So it's about thinking outside the box, thinking inward, and we imagine a positive outlook in terms of the sector for next year generally.
All right, we'll be tracking it with you, of course, on board. Thank you so much for your perspective on the show today. AbdulMajeed Amussah, CEO and founder, Dares Nigeria.
Thank you so much. Wishing you happy holidays and all your guests as well.
Same to you.